I want to start with my newest work called Magna Carta Redux, or Revisited. I did this in collaboration with my videographer, my talented young videographer, Jung-A. And this video was inspired by a man named William Binney. William Binney came on an independent news program called Democracy Now! Last spring. And he warned the American people. He said that we've lost the protection of the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure. He didn't say we're losing the protection. He said we've lost the protection of the Fourth Amendment. Number one, he said our emails and phone calls are under surveillance. Number two, he said that surveillance is warrantless. Number three, he said our data is not encrypted to ensure our privacy. How does he know this? He worked for the NSA, or National Security Agency, for 30 years. He was the technical director of Foreign Signals Intelligence. He designed a program called Thin Thread to organize and decipher foreign intelligence signals. And at the same time, he encrypted American data to ensure our privacy. I want to ask you as a group, does it matter to you that our data is no longer private? Does it matter to you that anyone with a security clearance can look at your mail without a warrant? If it does bother you, then what can we do about this? Besides writing to our congressman, what can we do about this? William Binney resigned from the NSA when he realized that the program he designed for foreign intelligence is now being used domestically against the American people. And he resigned in 2001. And the other question I have is, if William Binney could encrypt our data in the year 2000 when he designed this program, why in the year 2013 is our data not being encrypted so that our privacy is maintained? This is from an installation called Maypole Mayhem. You see a veil covering an article. This article was by a Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. Daniel Davis was on the second tour of duty in Afghanistan in 2010, and he toured the country and he spoke to soldiers, he spoke to officers, and what he discovered was things with the Afghan National Army are not the way they're being portrayed in the press. There were a lot of problems. And he published this article in the Armed Forces Journal. And my first thought was, isn't he brave, like, to write this article and have it published? Won't there be repercussions against him? My second thought was, how come Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis was the one to write this article? Where was our press? Why don't we know about the Afghan war? Why don't we know about the Afghan people? Where are our investigative journalists? How come a soldier wrote this article? And that's very disturbing. How can we know nothing about the people living in Central Asia or the Middle East? It's just a vacuum. It reminded me of a 2006 editorial I read in the Times called Telling Sunni from Shiite. A reporter had polled some congressmen, and he had asked these congressmen, do you know the difference between Sunnis and Shiites? These are people who are actually making our foreign policy. And several of them had no idea what the difference was in 2006 between Sunni and Shiite people. And I thought, like, what's wrong with this picture? Is it our educational schools that are like not teaching properly? Is it the press? Where are we going wrong? Why is it that congressmen don't know the difference? If our congressmen don't know the difference, how can the average American know the difference? It's called Home on the Range. It's a takeoff on a very famous American painting by Grant Wood called American Gothic. And Grant Wood was portraying a typical American couple in the 1930s, and I updated it to a typical American couple in the year 2012. Watching TV, the dots I got from a Wonder Bread package. The point with this picture is that there is very little international news anymore on network TV. Maybe they've reduced it like 2 minutes. One station has 80 seconds around the world. Don't the American people have any more patience than 80 seconds for the rest of the world? And that's why I have the map of America in the background. Because what's happened is we're living in this bubble where we know everything about the entertainment of America and the crime of America, and we know really, really less and less about what's beyond our borders. And I think that's really dangerous. So the painting looks kind of funny, but it's really a serious painting. This painting is called Button Mushroom. It's a conceptual painting, and it's a painting about nuclear proliferation. I was thinking about the word button and how the meaning of the word button changes depending on the context. So a button could be something you wear, or it could be something you press to start a nuclear war. And in this case, the sign or the symbol of button changes depending on the context in which the button is used or seen. So it's a conceptual work. This is called Bosnia Bobbit. I used to flip back and forth in the 1990s between BBC News and American News. And American News was filled for weeks and weeks with this poor marital couple and their problems, the Bobbits. Some of you may remember that. And BBC was covering in depth the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. And I thought, this is so weird. On one hand, I'm looking at terrible scenes of destruction in Bosnia, the former Yugoslavia. Then I go to American News and I'm hearing about the Bobbits. It's like, what's wrong with this picture? What's happened to our news industry? It's very upsetting when you compare what we're being fed and what's really happening in the rest of the world. This painting is called Portrait of Two Women. It's a takeoff on a Gerhard Richter painting over here called Portrait of a Young Woman. Gerhard Richter made a portrait of Ulrike Meinhof. She was one of the leaders of the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany. It was a gang that tried to change the German government through violence. It was a criminal gang. And his portrait is quite beautiful. He glamorizes her. So what I did was I took his idea of the portrait, and I wanted to show two American heroines whose behavior has been criminalized, but who are in fact heroines in American history. This is Bonatine Greenhouse. I met Bonatine Greenhouse. In 2003, she was the head of U.S. contracting for the U.S. Army. And they came to her and asked her for a 5-year no-bid contract to restore the oil wells in Iraq, a no-bid contract. And she said no. I've been in contracting for 20 years. I've never been asked to give anyone a 5-year no-bid contract, and I won't do it. The young lady over there is Christine Axsmith. She worked for a CIA subsidiary called BAE Systems, and in the private blog she wrote, "Waterboarding is torture." Well, it wasn't so private. She was fired the next day. Bunny was demoted. And she has since won a lawsuit for $1 million in back pay. So she has a happy conclusion. This is called Betsy's Dilemma, and what it talks about are the changing values of American society. For a while, we didn't really adhere to the Geneva Conventions in terms of our treatments of prisoners of war. That has since changed, but this painting was in response to those years. This is Dusk Railroad, and it's almost an exact copy of Edward Hopper's Railroad Sunset. Edward Hopper painted the quintessential American lonely landscape. And I was thinking about all the changes in America since 9/11, and I was thinking that what's really changed in our landscape is that we're losing the Bill of Rights. We're losing the protections that our forefathers gave us. And it's actually a frightening painting, because as we lose one or more of our amendments to the Bill of Rights, you have to wonder, what is America becoming? What is our society going to be? In the war of terror, how will America become less democratic? This painting is called What Did You Learn in School Today? And it looks like a happy painting. We have Shirley Temple and Pluto in the foreground. And again, the Wonder Bread dots. But underneath it all, there are the words Agent Orange and depleted uranium. And I don't think the American people have any idea that the weapons that we use persist in the environment, not for years, but for decades. There are still young people in Vietnam who are being born with birth defects because dioxin persists in groundwater and soil. So all the people who lived around the areas that were defoliated with Agent Orange, they're still there. They haven't moved. So their children are being born with birth defects. Depleted uranium was used in the First and the Second Gulf War. And they used depleted uranium in shells that, upon impact, this uranium dust spread over miles and miles of territory. And around Fallujah today, there are a lot of children now being born with birth defects. And this isn't really being publicized. And I think if the American people knew how devastating these weapons were, there would be an outcry to stop them from production. They shouldn't be produced. I mean, there are other ways of conducting a war without using such terrible, terrible weapons. This painting is called Cyclone. It's an abstract painting. And since it is abstract, basically it focuses on the fact that oil, this is like an oil spill, petroleum dependency is at the center of our culture. And the little strips around the edge refer to the fact that film or entertainment is fundamental to our lifestyle. This is one of my more recent works. It's called No News is Good News. And it kind of developed like a detective story. I was really wondering whether or not Obama was going to sign the 2012 NDAA, or National Defense Authorization Act. It was controversial because besides funding the military, it also gave our military the ability to arrest terrorism suspects in this country, as if it were like an extra police force. Interestingly, the FBI director, Robert Mueller, was against this provision because he said it would complicate his arrest procedures. So I was really curious whether or not Obama would sign this, and I found out a week after the fact on the internet that he had signed this bill. And I thought, well, how did that happen? I look at the news constantly. It's like, of all people, how did I miss this? So I had thrown out my newspapers. So I sent away for the New York Times first, and I found it on page 22. And I thought, well, that's curious. Let me go to the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer. I kept sending away to more and more and more papers. And if you look at them after my talk, you'll see that the signing of the NDAA is really nowhere to be seen, except in one paper, the Dallas Morning News. It's right here. I thought, well, isn't that curious? It's so strange. And I thought, well, why wouldn't the American people want to know if the military can suddenly arrest terrorism suspects? I mean, why wasn't that important? How was this editorial decision made? Isn't this a suppression of really important news? And I thought, well, maybe I'm overreacting. But then Chris Hedges sued President Obama. Chris Hedges is a journalist, and he writes about terrorist groups. He wondered if he could be accused of supporting terrorism by publishing articles about terrorism. Judge Catherine Forrest, serving on the U.S. District Court for the Southern District, agreed that his First and Fifth Amendment rights were in jeopardy. She asked government lawyers, could a YouTube video or an article be construed to be supporting terrorism? The government lawyers had no answer. Their lack of response is what gave the case standing in court. This artwork is really a canary in the coal mine. It questions how much news of vital importance to our future are we missing? Do we even know the answer? Propaganda usually refers to the spread of misleading or biased information. In this case, our citizens are living in an information vacuum or a form of inverse propaganda, where the omission of international and domestic news items makes it impossible for the American citizen to respond in a meaningful fashion. Not only do we not know what's happening, we're not aware that we don't know what's happening. It's a very serious development in the news profession, where the omission of news is affecting our lives in a very basic way. This is called Yankee Doodle Went to Town. It's a postmodern painting. It's based on a painting by Tom Wesselman called Still Life Number 28. You can see in his painting that Lincoln features very prominently in his composition. I replaced Lincoln with a crew from an oil rig. And basically it's talking about the fact that the oil industry has a very strong influence on our government now. White House, Your House. It looks like a funny painting. The pants in the middle of the painting are Bill Clinton's. For those of you who remember the Lewinsky affair, That went on for months and months and months in the press, months. I don't know how long it went on. And I kept wondering in those years, like, was anything else happening in the world? And curiously enough, in 1998, a fellow named Osama bin Laden wrote an article in a London newspaper called Jihad Against Christians and Jews. Now, he called on all the Muslim people to attack Americans and their allies all over the world. Did you hear about the article? I didn't hear about it. No. And what's really curious is that in 1997, CNN had interviewed Osama bin Laden. He was on the radar. He wasn't off the radar. He was on the radar. And you have to wonder, since they didn't pick up on this article because their attention was elsewhere, how would that have affected our national security? How would that have affected our future? News isn't just something you hear about. It's supposed to warn us about current events. What's happening? There are a lot of dangers in the world, and there are a lot of dangers about America, focused on America, but we're not hearing about them. Why aren't we hearing about them? There was an editorial just a couple of weeks ago in the Times by Bill Keller. It was called Being There. And he was talking about the Benghazi affair and about why it was so hard to find out what happened in Benghazi. Well, you know what? We have no reporters in Libya. Who is going to do the investigation? Somebody else? Who are we relying on? It's not just a problem in 1998, it's a problem in 2013. I'm going to end with this painting. It's called Great American News. It was influenced by a painting by James Rosenquist called F-111, news model with the entertainment signs. And that's the problem. In the 1990s, news became entertainment. There's a very thin line between the two. You know, there's a real danger in an age of media consolidation where 6 companies control most of the news that we see. And in these 6 companies that control the news, there's a danger because in media consolidation, what it means is there's a cross-fertilization between different companies. And we're living in an age where military companies now also own media companies. This fall, a program came on the air called Stars Earn Stripes. I don't know if any of you saw it. 2 teams were competing for a prize through doing military exercises. A retired general was the MC. And I thought, well, that's really weird. And then I read that Bishop Desmond Tutu actually wrote to the head of the station that produced the show to ask that war not be turned into an entertainment. And my question to all of you is, why doesn't Congress have laws forbidding the dual ownership of military and media companies? Isn't that dangerous? Isn't there some slippage where the people who are on the board of companies that make military equipment are also on the board of companies that produce news? I think that's a very dangerous thing. In conclusion, I want to say that news is not and should never be a business. I love Hillary Clinton, but when she said that Al Jazeera, Russian and Chinese TV are winning the information war, she proposed a U.S. Department of Propaganda to counter this threat. I disagree. On the contrary, what this country needs is its own news service of the people, by the people, and for the people. Why not set aside a tax of 1% on every TV and computer sold in this country for an American news service run by journalists and not by market research consultants? A news service that is free of corporate or foundation influence. A news service answerable only to people. Our freedom of speech and our democracy depend on it. Thank you so much for coming.